I was surprised to learn from your book that you made the point that the vote was not necessarily popular with women back when female suffrage was being debated. That seems extraordinary to our ears, the idea that there would have been women who thought this was not a good idea. Was that somehow part and parcel of this attempt to rein men in that you're talking about and bring them back to the drawing board? Back to
Absolutely.
involvement?
Yes. Yes, yes. And I didn't realize how controversial that section of the book would be, but I've had a lot of people contradict, like, what? But so I was very careful to quote people of the time. I have several quotes from the anti-suffragists of the day. And what they argued was they were not arguing male vote versus female vote. They framed it as individual vote versus family vote or household vote.
Right.
And they were very concerned that if men started acting unilaterally as an individual and voting, that he would no longer feel constrained to represent the whole household. And that was their concern, is that it was reducing the sense of responsibility on men. That was their concern. It was letting men off the hook, right? It was saying, you can go vote however you want and not think about the impact on your whole family, your whole household. Remember, households were bigger than just a nuclear family then, too. Usually it was extended family and possibly servants and hired hands and others, would all. And the father was the head of that small commonwealth and was supposed to vote for the interest of the whole. In fact, the whole notion of authority back then, today we think authority kind of means I get to do what I want. Back then, the concept of authority was you have responsibility for the common good of the whole. It came out of classical republicanism, but that was the father was considered not just an individual, but he spoke for the whole. He had responsibility for the common good of the whole. And so that's what people were afraid that would be lost, that it was a much bigger question than we tend to realize, that it was a question of whether we would lose a political philosophy that focused on the common good and making the person in authority responsible for the common good of the whole. And so that would affect families. Of course, it affects churches and schools and civil society as well. But here we're talking specifically about how it affected fathers. And how did we lose that? Well, first it started when we had universal male suffrage. When men could vote, even if they weren't head of household. Well, then women looked at that and said, well, wait a minute, men are already voting as individuals. If men are voting as individuals, they're not taking the household into account, then we'd better have the vote. And it's kind of poignant because you read the quotes from the day, and literally one of a labor union leader, female, said, women need the vote because men, even good men, cannot be trusted to take our interest into account. So the shift in political philosophy that said the person in authority no longer is responsible for the common good meant women felt like they were no longer being protected by a man who represented the household. So that was really quite sad. That was an important step in women losing their trust that men would, in fact, take responsibility for their whole family and household.
That's an interesting light, in a sense, to shine on the fact that, believe it or not, Australia and New Zealand were the first places where the vote was extended to women. It happened in New Zealand first, although the laws to allow women to vote first happened in South Australia, the state of South Australia, down here quite early on. And in South Australia, it was led by, interestingly, Christian women, the Women's Temperance Alliance, it was known as. And they must have already reached the point where they felt their men were not necessarily to be trusted with looking after their best interests in terms of the thinking that you put forward, which may very well have been true. They might have been right.
Well, it took a century. It took roughly a century. Yes, eventually women came around to supporting the vote. And why? The women's, you're right, here in the States as well, the women's temperance movement changed their mind on the vote. But here's what they did. They renamed the vote the ballot for home protection. The women's temperance movement said we need to give women the vote because women who have alcoholic husbands who are coming home and beating them have no recourse. And so if women have the vote, they can hold men in check. Remember, this is the temperance movement. So they're very concerned that men are, drinking away the family money, and they're coming home and beating their wives and children. And so they eventually came to see the vote as a way of giving women a voice for temperance. You have to put this in context. Sometimes a single fact can help. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there's a reason there was a temperance movement. Public drunkenness had become quite a problem. People falling down drunk in the alleys and so on. And so you're right. Eventually, women started saying the vote is going to give women some leverage against these male vices, in particular alcoholism, that's destroying our families. So that's why they changed their perspective and began to support the vote.